Hello Year 7 and welcome to your first lesson on Tudor England. Now first of all, you have been told in your starter activity that as part of our new topic we're going to be looking at the Tudors and the Stuarts, and we're going to be looking at the theme of power and religion. So our first lesson is going to be about the power of the church, and we're going to look at this in some detail so we can understand why there was a struggle of power between the church and the monarch at the time, and what changes existed in terms of religion and power throughout this period in history. So you should have already completed a starter activity as part of your team's live introduction with your teacher. We're now going to make a start on today's lesson. Don't forget that you should pause this video when I ask you to, because you will need to do that to complete the tasks. And of course you can rewind things if you need to, and don't forget that your teacher is on Teams for the whole lesson if you need to ask any questions. Let's make a start. So first of all, what I'd like to do is write down today's title, which you can find just here. The title is How Far Was Power of the Church at the Start of the Tudor Dynasty a Problem? So make sure that you've got that down on your piece of paper or in your books. Now within this lesson we're going to be talking about the Catholic Church, which held a lot of power in England during the medieval period and at the start of the Tudor period. We're going to look at the different ways of which the church held power. We're also going to be thinking about whether this power was good or bad for the people of England, and we'll then be thinking about whether England was in need of some reform or change within the church and religion at this time. So hopefully by the end of the lesson you would be able to answer this question, which is your title today. So let's get started. Okay guys, now before we get started on today's main activities, I just wanted to do a bit of an introduction for you to cover a few key points that I think you need to be aware of before we get started on today's topic. Now first of all, I'm going to start off by talking about the fact that we are looking at power and religion. Now in the medieval times and at the start of the Tudor dynasty, power and religion were entwined, which means they were really closely linked together. That's because religion actually played an important part in politics and running the country. King or the Queen would have to have a very good relationship with the church. So it's important that power and religion kind of work together, but sometimes it clashed. And sometimes, for example, religion or the church wanted perhaps more power. Sometimes the monarch, the king or the queen, sometimes they wanted more power, and it would lead to a power struggle. You might remember that is something that happened under Thomas Becket. Becket wanted to make sure the church was powerful, whereas obviously King Henry II at the time, wanted the monarch or the king to be more powerful than the church. So it's important we know that that is something that's kind of gone on throughout the medieval times, but we're now looking at the start of the Tudor dynasty. Now the Tudor dynasty is basically like the royal family, the Tudor royal family, and it starts off with Henry VII in 1485, which I'm just going to type out here for you. 1485 is the date when the Tudor dynasty begins. It's actually the 22nd of August 1485 when Henry VII defeats Richard III, who was the last Yorkist king, basically on the battlefield at Bosworth. Now, when King Henry VII becomes king, he starts the Tudor dynasty because his name was Henry Tudor. And so obviously that's why it's called the Tudor dynasty, the Tudor family, or the Tudor era. It's basically to do with that family line, that family name. Now, Henry VII was not the only Tudor. He had his son, Henry VIII, and his grandchildren, Edward and Mary and Elizabeth, ruled after their father. Now, ultimately, the entire family is known as the Tudor dynasty, and what we're going to be looking at is what happened during this Tudor dynasty. We're going to look at each different monarch. We're not going to look at Henry VII too much, unfortunately. We don't get a chance to, but we are going to look at the other four monarchs, and we're going to be talking about power and religion throughout their reigns. Now, it's important that you guys know that the Tudor era itself, this period with this family, actually witnessed the most sweeping religious changes in England since the arrival of Christianity in England. And this affected every aspect of national life in England. We call it the Reformation. Now, I'm going to use that word a lot, so you might, if you want to, you might want to get down the actual definition for Reformation, because that's a word I'm going to use a lot. So you might want to make sure you've got that written down so you know what it is. Now, the Reformation was a movement, a religious movement, which caused England to move away from Catholicism, which is Catholics, and actually move towards a new, more reformed church called the Protestant Church, which was basically Protestantism. Now, again, don't worry if you've not heard of those words before, if you're not familiar with Protestantism and Catholicism, because I am going to talk to you about what they are in a minute. Okay, but what I just want you to know is that basically throughout the Reformation, England moved away from Catholicism and Catholics towards a Protestant nation instead. It's important that you know they're both Christians, just different types of Christians, different traditions, different methods. Now, it's important that for us to understand these changes and how they affected England, we need to know more about the power of the church, and we need to know more about how that changes with the Reformation. The other thing I want to make it clear to you guys is about the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Who was in control? First of all, the Pope. Many of you may have heard of the Pope in our previous topics. He's the head of the Catholic Church and he lives in Rome. Cardinals are also quite high up in the Catholic Church. They are advisors to the Pope and they do a lot of the paperwork and the administration for the Church. Now, the bishops and archbishops are also quite important. They tend to be quite superior over cathedrals or regions. So, for example, we looked at Thomas Becket. He was an Archbishop of Canterbury. We also have an Archbishop of York, for example. These are religious superiors, people who control regions of the country for the church. We also have priests in the Catholic Church. So basically they are religious people that have some authority over a parish or a village or a town. So you might have a parish priest that might be your local priest in your local church. And also there were these things called monastic orders. You may have heard of monks or nuns. They basically often lived in places called monasteries or nunneries, and they were supervised by somebody called an abbot or an abbess. So basically you have people that are devoted, so devoted to their religion, they live their life practicing that in a sacred place like a monastery. So they're people that are part of the Catholic Church. So I will possibly mention those at time to time. So it's important that you know who they are. If you want to, you could pause the video now and write down each of those different people if you'd like, but you don't have to. Let's make a start with our activities for today. Okay guys, our first activity is to look at how different Catholic and Protestant beliefs and practices were. As I've mentioned to you guys, Catholics and Protestants are both Christians. So there's some things that they are similar in. So here's a list of things that they both believe in. For example, Catholics and Protestants, they both believe that God created the world. They both believed that Jesus was God's son. And those who challenge the true faith must be punished. That's what both believed, particularly at this time. So ultimately, that's something that they have in common. However, there are some differences with the way that people might practice their faith or the beliefs that they have. What I'd like you to do is pause this video now and have a little think about reasons why Catholics and Protestants might disagree. What do they disagree on? Can you find some examples? Now, what you might want to do is just jot a few down on your piece of paper or in your book, just bullet points of differences between Catholics and Protestants. Pause the video now and have a little look. Okay, so hopefully you've managed to find that there are a number of key things that are different between the two. Now, although Protestants and Catholics both use the Bible and have church services, they are different in language. For example, Catholics had their practices in Latin, whereas Protestants had it in English. There are some key things like who would control the church, because Catholics believed that the Pope was the head of the church and was God's anointed on earth, whereas Protestants believe that actually the monarch should be the head of the church. Now remember, a monarch is a king or a queen. There's also differences between the way that they look. Take a look at these pictures here. You can see that in a Catholic church, they are highly decorated, lots of colour and gold and blues, whereas in a Protestant church, you can see here, it's much more plain. So they're different in the way that they look inside. On top of that, we'll also see that there are some differences in their practices. You may have seen or heard of bread and wine being used in Christian services. And quite often you might hear that it is also something that is linked with the body and the blood of Christ. There's a difference here because Catholics believed in transubstantiation, which basically meant that the bread and the wine transforms into the body and blood of Jesus, whereas Protestants believed that it only represented the body and the blood. So that basically means essentially it just is representing him. It can't become him. The last one that I wanted to mention is the point about the connections with God. Protestants believe that the Bible should be in English because they wanted ordinary people to connect with God through prayer personally themselves, whereas Catholics believed that the priests were actually the people's link with God. And that's something that basically was reformed in the Reformation. So I hope you managed to pick out a few of those key points, and I hope you managed to write some down. Let's move on to the next task. Okay, so your next activity, guys, is a comprehension task. Now, what that means is that you're going to read the information on the screen, and then you've got some questions that you need to answer. Now, there are 6 questions in total, but I've broken it down slide by slide. So as you can see on this slide, you only need to answer questions 1 and 2. And all of the answers can be found in the information above just here. So what you've got to do is read through the information and then answer the questions on your piece of paper or in your book, depending on whether you've got it with you. It's important that you do answer the questions in full sentences. So let's have a go at doing the first one together, and then the rest of them I'm going to ask you to do on your own. So question 1 is, what would the English people be taught from a young age? Let's read the passage here, and then we'll basically decide what the answer would be. Listen along as I read this bit for you. Before Henry VIII's break with the papacy, that's the Pope, in the 1530s, the Roman Catholic Church was all-powerful in England. Only a small, persecuted minority questions its doctrines. Now, what that means is teachings, by the way. Its doctrines are the teachings. And if it's a minority, it means that there was only a small group of people that questioned these teachings. The early years of Henry's reign also saw traditional religious practices such as pilgrimages, saints' holidays, and religious plays enthusiastically observed, together with the continued building and embellishment of churches that had been a major feature of the reign of his father, Henry VII. Now, what that means is that buildings were embellished, they were decorated, and they were rebuilt and revamped essentially throughout this period, which showed how powerful and valued they were. The medieval church played a very dominant role in the lives of the peasants and the nobility alike. There is little evidence to suggest that there were many people who did not believe in God, heaven, and hell. From a young age, the English would be taught that devoting oneself to the Roman Catholic Church was the only way to heaven, and that hell was a place to be avoided at all costs. So question 1, what would the English people be taught from a young age? Now, it's important for a full sentence that you turn the question into an answer. So what you would say is, English people were taught from a young age that, and then you write out the bit that you need. So I think we've hopefully all understood that we're going to need this bit. So it would say, English people were taught from a young age that devoting oneself to the Catholic Church was the only way to heaven. Okay? Question 2, why would teaching this help with law and order in England? So you've got to think about why, if you're teaching people their only way to get to heaven is to follow the Catholic Church and its rules, why do you think that might have actually helped with law and order? Why might that have helped with stopping people commit crimes, do you think? And I want you to answer question 2 on your own. So what do you think? And also think back to our kind of, our understanding of crime and punishment from our last topic. We know, don't we, that at this time there was no police force. So think about why actually the church might have been able to help with law and order if this is what they were teaching to people. Okay, so what I'd like to do is pause the slide now, or pause this video, so that you can answer questions 1 and 2. Please don't move on until you've done those, and make sure they're in full sentences, guys, because then they will make sense when you read them back. Okay, guys, what you've now got to do is answer question 3, which you can see just here. And the answer to question 3 is in this section. Now, you don't need to write, of course, everything down. What you need to do is read this section first, so give it a good read. And then once you've read it, try and answer the question, how were peasants controlled by the church? Now, you can write this out as, again, a sentence or a couple of sentences just about how did the church control the peasants. Now, remember from our last topic, peasants were the lower people of society. They were the common people, the farmers, the workers, that sort of thing. Okay, so look at what the church did to make sure that peasants were controlled. Read it first and then answer the question. Okay, guys, this is our last slide of comprehension now. So again, you've just got to read this section straight through. Read it carefully and then answer questions 4, 5 and 6. So question 4 is, how wealthy was the church and why? So give some reasons why the church was wealthy if you think it was. How did the church demonstrate its wealth? That means, how did it show off its wealth? How did the church show people how wealthy and powerful they were? And also, what kind of political power did the church have? Now, what that means is, what power did they have in government? What power did they have in terms of lawmaking and decision making in the country? Okay, so what I'd like to do is read the information carefully, answer these last 3 questions, and you will want to pause the slide to do this. But guys, if you're struggling with these questions, don't panic. At the end of this video, I'm going to go through the answers with you. So if you're struggling, you can leave one blank and go to the end, obviously once you've finished all of the tasks today, and then just check out the answers. Okay, just give it your best shot, answer the questions, and if you want to check the answers, you can later on. Right, Year 7, so well done for completing all of the comprehension questions. Sometimes it can take a long time with all the reading and obviously writing out in full sentences, so well done for doing that. What I'm now going to ask you to do is do some consolidation questions. Now, what that means is I want you to consolidate what you've read today and try and figure out what your opinion is on some certain questions. So you've read through all of the information, you've answered some questions. What you've now got to do is tell me, overall, how powerful was the church in medieval England and why? You've got to tell me, do you think they were very powerful, they were quite powerful, or do you think they were not very powerful? Question 2, you then got to tell, do you think it was a good thing that the church had this much power? And again, explain your answer. So you can say, yes, I think it was a good thing that the church had this much power because, or no, I don't think this was a good thing because, and just tell me why you think that. Now, what I'd like to do is, once you've written out these full answers in your book or on your piece of paper, I would like you to share your answer just to question 2 on Teams now. So go onto Teams and tell your teacher what you've thought about question 2. Okay, your teacher will be waiting for you to respond. So get in touch with your teacher quickly on Teams. You don't have to write out your full paragraph. Just quickly tell them, do you think it was a good thing that the church had this much power or not? And tell them why. Your teacher will be really interested to see what your opinion is. Make sure that you've written your answer in your book first and then share it with your teacher afterwards. Okay guys, what we're now going to be looking at is the different reasons for why the church was powerful. Each of these different white boxes, which are labelled with A, B, C, D, so on, they basically tell you different reasons for why the church had power. But what you've got to do is basically decide which ones of these reasons are the most or the least important for why the church had power. So for example, you can see in box A here, that the church was powerful because everybody believed in heaven and hell. People saw doom paintings in churches, they were scared of hell, and they believed that they had to obey the church to get to heaven. You can also see in C, for example, that churches were very big and expensive. The church had to be rich to build these great buildings that demonstrated their power. You can also look at F, how it says the Catholic Church was led by the Pope. The king could not tell anyone from the church what to do because they were led by the Pope. So there's just 3 examples, but there are 8 different reasons here about why the church was powerful. All you've got to do is decide which one of these reasons is the most important reason for why the church was powerful. And then your 8 is your least important reason for why the church was powerful. Before you begin this activity, I'd now like you to very quickly write down in your books or on your paper letters of the boxes. So you can see in this pink box here, look, that I've just put A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. You need to write those letters down just like that because you're then going to write down your numbers next to it. So can you all do that very quickly now, please? And then basically, guys, your number 1 is the one that you think is the most important one. So your number 1 is the most important or most significant reason for why the church had power. Your number 8 is the least significant, it's the least important reason for why the church had power. So you've got to read each of these boxes and think about, right, yeah, that one shows that the church is really powerful. Then you might have your number 8 that is like, well, it kind of gives them some power, but it also, you know, it's not as important as number 1. So you've got to basically think about which one is your number 1, which one is your number 8. These are all reasons why the church was powerful, but you've got to decide which is the most important reason for why they had power. Be prepared, obviously, to explain your judgment, but make sure you've at least numbered these boxes, obviously, from this activity. I'm going to now remove that box there so that you can now all see all 8 of the boxes. Can you now read these carefully, guys? You might want to pause the video now and then write down number 1 to 8 next to your letters, telling me whether they are the most or least important reason for why the church had power. Okay, guys, we've talked quite a bit today about the power of the church and what sort of things they could do. What I'd now like to think about is, what did people at the time think about this? Because obviously you might have your own opinions now about whether you thought this was a good or a bad thing that the church had this much power. But it's important that we think about, what did the people at the time think? And it's important that you guys know that most ordinary people were devoted to their religion. People really, really cared about their religion. And people really cared about their parish churches. Their parish churches in their area that they go to regularly. They really care about those churches. People actually paid money to these churches quite regularly. They also, in lots of cases, left money in their wills for these churches to make sure that they were kept, steady, and that they were kept, luxurious and looked after. So people really did care about these churches. They were very happy with their religious experience. People believed it was very necessary to have a religious experience like theirs. So generally, people were quite happy. However, there were some small groups, like the Lollards, who disliked how powerful the church had become. Now, these people were also Christians, but they actually believed the church had become corrupt. They felt like it was using its wealth and its power to benefit themselves rather than the church and the people. And the Lollards, they basically hoped there would be some sort of reforming religion. They were still Christian, they still wanted to follow Christianity, but they wanted to see some changes in the church because they felt like the church was corrupt in some way. So there's a few examples. Let me tell you a bit about some of the examples of why people at the time, like the Lollards, criticised the Catholic Church. Some of the reasons is to do with its wealth. Now, for example, the Pope and some of the leading members of the church, like, for example, the Bishop of Winchester at this time, actually earned the same amount as a leading nobleman. So what that tells us is that some members of the church were really rich, and that is not something that was expected. When people took their vows towards the church, quite often they vow for more poverty, and they vow to take care of the church over themselves and their own wealth. So it was quite interesting to see even monasteries and the monks living there having vast amounts of wealth, and that was something that the Lollards didn't agree with. They believed that the church should actually care about their religion and the people before themselves and their own wealth. Some other examples are things like pluralism. Now, pluralism meant that some religious leaders had more than one role. So what that might mean is that a bishop might be a bishop in Winchester, Essex, Durham. There could basically be a bishop in lots of different parts of the country. Well, that's a problem, isn't it? Because you can't be in more than one place at one time. So what that means is that quite often they weren't there and they weren't doing their jobs, and that affected people's religious experience. And that was only really because some people were taking on too many roles, and sometimes they had political roles too. So what I'm trying to say is that the Lollards, they disliked some of the corruption, they disliked the wealth, they disliked some of the people not taking their jobs seriously, and therefore they wanted to see some change. Now, this is obviously normal people, but what about the Tudor family? What about the royal family? Well, Henry VII, who was the first Tudor king, was a devout Catholic. He really believed that the church was important, and he thought it was important to actually help him stay in power. Now, generally, his relationship with the church was very positive. And actually, even though there was some Lollard activity, people criticising the church, it was never really supported by the king, and it was never supported by his government. And also, it's important we know, many of the people in Henry's government were also churchmen. So Henry VII had a very good relationship with the church. Henry VIII, his son, was also a devout Catholic. Again, that means he was very committed to being a Catholic. He also actually wanted to be the Archbishop of Canterbury, He actually had an older brother called Arthur who was meant to be king. And so Henry VIII didn't know he was going to be king, and instead he wanted to be Archbishop of Canterbury. Unfortunately, his brother died and he had to step up and become king. He was really interested in religion, and he was even called the Defender of the Faith by the Pope in 1521. Now, this meant that basically Henry VIII had defended the Pope against people that criticised him. So this shows that actually the Pope and the Catholic Church were well supported by the Tudor family. What I'm asking you guys to do now is just answer this question here. So based on this information, and obviously your notes from today, I want you to answer this question. Do you personally think religion in England was in need of reform or change or not? So do you personally think that at this time, religion and the church just stayed as it was? Do you think it was quite fine as it was, or do you think that some things might have needed to change? Do you think things needed to be reformed slightly or just slightly altered? Is there anything that you think people at the time would have appreciated in terms of change and reform, or do you think actually it should have just stayed as it was, things were going well? So what I'd like to do is use all of the information from today's lesson, and can you answer that question in your books, please? Pause the video now so that you can do that. Now, the playing activity you need to do with your teacher on Teams for the last 5 minutes of the lesson. Earlier in the lesson, I asked you whether you thought the power of the Catholic Church in England was positive or negative. Now, obviously, you've looked at some more information since then. So I want you to think about whether your opinion has changed since I last asked you to tell your teacher about this. I want you to think about how the church used its power, but also how the people felt about the church at the time. After you've considered all of this information, I want you to make sure that you tell your teacher on Teams in the last 5 minutes whether you think the church overall was good in the way that it used its power or not, and make sure you explain why. Now, if you are done with today's work and you're happy with everything that you've done, you can stop the video now. However, if you do want to check the answers for the comprehension questions we did earlier, then keep watching the video, but you can stop the video now. Okay? Thank you very much for listening to those of you that need to go now, and I will speak to you all next week. Take care. Okay guys, we already did question 1 together earlier on, but I'm going to quickly go through question 2 for anybody that was stuck. So why we're teaching the idea that the only way to get to heaven was by following the Catholic Church, why would this help with law and order in England? So you've got to think about the fact that if people are following the Catholic Church and its rules, quite often these messages were about being a good citizen, you know, looking after your neighbours and making sure that you were just generally not putting other people at harm. Obviously, those messages were very helpful for law and order. People knew that if they committed murder, if they were stealing things, then basically they were committing sins. They were going against the church and the expectations of their parish, and therefore they would expect that would mean they wouldn't go to heaven. So generally, the Catholic Church telling people that they had to be good and they had to do the right things in order to get to heaven, that would actually really help with law and order, because people want to avoid hell at all costs. Nobody wants to end up there. Okay, so that's what you kind of needed to mention for question 2. Okay guys, so obviously the peasants were controlled by the church in lots of other ways, like for example it does mention at the top that the church generally had complete control over the whole population, but peasants in particular were expected to work free of charge on church land. And also you've got to think about the fact that they had a significant amount of work to do on the land, and they rented this from their lord. So they were already having to do lots and lots of hours on the land for their lord. When it says their lord, that means like their noblemen, they tend to work on their land. But then they've also got to work for free on church land as well. So that would have been really difficult in terms of like the hours you'd have to work. But also, peasants would have to offer the church 10% of their annual earnings. Obviously, again, you've got to think about the fact that peasants did not earn very much. They had to really get by on the very bare minimum. So the fact that they would have to offer the church 10% of their annual earnings, that was obviously quite difficult. And they would also deliver this in either money or produce. It's important we know that they might often give up their livestock, which they might use for food, or even seeds for the crops that they would grow. Now, obviously, this really damaged their ability to be able to produce the maximum amount of crops or meat the following year. So by giving it to the church, they suffered in the hands of that. Peasants were frequently warned if they didn't pay this sum, their souls were going to go to hell after death. And as I've mentioned, people really wanted to avoid that. So people would put themselves, in harm's way in terms of poverty in order to make sure that they were protected by the church from going to hell. So that is a way that basically the church was able to control the peasants this time in the country. Okay, so question 4, were very, very wealthy, and the reason why is because they basically had a lot of funds being paid to them, as mentioned on the last slide, but also they did not have to pay taxes like everybody else, and this saved them a lot of money. They were actually wealthier than the royal family. That's important to know. Now, in terms of obviously how did they demonstrate their power for question 5, well, they often did this through church buildings like cathedrals and monasteries, which were built so well that they actually remain in excellent condition even today. So, for example, some of you may have seen places like Canterbury Cathedral, York Cathedral, Lincoln Cathedral is much more local. These buildings were built a very, very long time ago. I mean, Lincoln Cathedral was built in like just after 1066, around that time after William conquered England. So you've got to think about the fact that, you know, these buildings lasted so long. They were also largest buildings constructed at this time. Again, you've got to think about the fact they were bigger than royal palaces. This was a constant reminder to people that they were powerful, because these buildings were the biggest buildings people had ever seen. People were fascinated by them. They really stood out. Question 6, what kind of political power did the church have? Well, basically, they did have quite a lot of influence in government. So, for example, bishops and archbishops had seats in the House of Lords. This meant in Parliament, and it meant that they had a voice in lawmaking. So when the king was trying to pass a law, basically the people who are bishops and archbishops, they got to have a say too. So that's basically the answer to question 6. Again, if you managed to go through these questions again, guys, and just double check them, well done. I hope that has managed to clarify anything that you're unsure about. But thank you very much for listening, guys, and take care.